It's great to be here again. I'm Isaac, and I hope everyone's having a good early March evening. I'm just here to give a brief hello from the folks at the New Haven Free Public Library. We want to welcome you to another talk with Yale Public Humanities, part of the Democracy in America series with Professor Matthew Jacobson and guest this evening, Professor David Roediger. Tonight's topic is Race in American Democracy. Professor Roediger published a book in 2020, The Sinking Middle Class, A Political History. It's available for borrowing at the library, as well as, of course, for purchase online. And I also just want to note that the library is open for curbside pickup. We have been open, and if you'd like to place a hold on any number of books, you can do so. And we're also hosting a webinar series, a discussion with authors. It's on Thursday at noon as part of our Book Sandwiched In series. I'm going to be talking with Yale professor Frank Snowden about his book, Epidemics and Society, and his thoughts on the present pandemic. So you can find more information at the library website. And once again, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Isaac. I'm Matthew Jacobson. I teach Public Humanities and American Studies at Yale. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to our partners at the New Haven Free Public Library, Isaac Shub, Marian Huggins, Seth Godfrey, and Luis Chavez Brunel in particular, but all of the folks over at the Public Library. Thanks to my colleagues, Karen Roffman, who has worked so hard for this series, and Swagato Chakraborty, who's working even now as we speak on the back end of this webinar. Program note, that next week there's a special Thursday edition of the Tuesday Night at the Library. March 11th, our colleague Phil Goff in African American Studies and Psychology and an expert in race and criminal justice will be speaking on the need for a third US Reconstruction. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome David Roediger. David took his PhD at Northwestern and has made many station stops on the Midwest circuit over the past few decades. Northwestern University, University of Missouri, University of Minnesota, University of Illinois, and he is now the Foundation Professor of American Studies at the University of Kansas. A little known fact about Dave, he began his career here at Yale working on the Frederick Douglass Papers. He is the author of more than 10 books on race and labor in the United States, both free and unfree labor, including The Wages of Whiteness, Race in the Making of the American Working Class, Colored White, Transcending the Racial Past, Working Toward Whiteness, How America's Immigrants Became White, Seizing Freedom, Slave Emancipation and Liberty for All, and as Isaac said, most recently, The Sinking Middle Class, A Political History. He's also written scores of articles, and he's edited 16 collections, including Black on White, a really important collection that rightly locates the origins of whiteness studies in African-American thought and the Black radical tradition. This was an incredibly important intervention just as whiteness studies was becoming slightly problematic for reasons that maybe we'll talk about. He is widely admired as a model activist scholar and also as a generous mentor to the younger folks coming up behind him, myself included, as I was just coming out of grad school many years ago now. Welcome, Dave. It's really great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Swagato and to Karen and to everyone else who did the work of making this possible.
Great. So, you know, you started writing about slavery and the white working class in the 19th century at the front end of your career. And over the years, you've written about the in-between whiteness of European immigrants, about the workings of race on the shop floor and in management, in Obama's America, in the history of the modern middle class. But you've done all of this work against the backdrop of Reaganism, neoliberalism, 9/11 and the Patriot Act, the vitriolic Tea Party backlash during the Obama years, and Trumpism. I'd love to hear you reflect on the development of your ideas in context. How would you narrate your own intellectual autobiography in dialogue with the often terrible times that we've been living through?
I'm going to give kind of a social history answer more than a political history answer, I think. Grew up in two places. I grew up in Southern Illinois in a little town that's now a suburb of St. Louis, but was a town built around a quarry and a grain mill. And my folks were quarry workers and printers and other kind of skilled workers. My mom taught grade school with 2 years of college, and 30 years later, finally graduated from college. So I came from this very union-minded and working class background, but at the same time, the little quarry town that I grew up in was what Midwesterners call a sundown town. That is, it was a town that the sociologist Jim Lowen writes about a lot and emphasizes that these were places that were probably a majority of towns at one point in Wisconsin and Illinois, in which African Americans were said to have to be out of town by sundown. So some had a billboard. My little town had a whistle, a 6 o'clock whistle, that only later did Lowen teach me was actually justified in terms of being a signal to African Americans who were never around anyway, that it was time to vacate town. At the same time, I was born in East St. Louis, and East St. Louis was becoming a black city, and that was just 8 miles up the road. So African-American culture was very much present. Tina Turner and Ike Turner was there. Miles Davis was in the area. But the town was a sundown town. And then the second place I grew up, because my mom was a single mom and needed help to have some life for her own. In the summers, I'd go down to the southern tip of Illinois to her hometown, which was Cairo, Illinois. And Cairo was a town that belatedly got the Black Freedom Movement. It was Jim Crow solidly advertised itself as further south than Louisville and further south than Baltimore. And this racist outpost in Illinois, more racist than even most of Illinois. And it had virtually a civil war of white vigilantes against Black project dwellers in the late 60s, when I would go there and spend my summers. And I was lucky enough to be allowed to go. I was raised Catholic, and I was lucky enough to be allowed to go to the Black Catholic Church because it was a place where my aunt, who worked a split shift as a telephone operator, could go there and work in church between her split in the shift. So I would have not been, but I was. And it turned out that the priest raced through Mass in about 20 minutes, which also was appealing to me at the time. But he raced through because the church was then the center of political education and the Black Freedom Movement. And so, you know, a lot of my being able to sustain a career, first of all, being interested in what white supremacy is, because I was experiencing white supremacy in such two different ways. One, a white supremacy with no Black people around and just making things up about African Americans. And the other, a place of pitched battles in a city that was half Black and half white. So the interest, I think, came from that, but then also the passion of it was very much from being exposed really at 12, 14, 15 years old to the Black Freedom Movement in Cairo. And then, you know, when I joined SDS when I was 16 in Georgia, and kind of came along to the New Left right as the New Left was ending. So I had a less of the disillusion and bitterness that some people who had lived through the rise and fall of the New Left had. I went to college so isolated, Northern Illinois University, that we didn't know that the New Left was over. So we still had an SDS chapter and things into the early 70s. So I feel very fortunate in those formative moments to be able to say, this is something that I want to think about from different angles over my whole life. At the same time, my work, as you pointed out at the beginning, is associated with whiteness and with African American studies. It really took me quite a long time to get there. I had a 10 or 12 year career as a more or less drearily conventional labor historian on the left. And my first book was on the working day in US history and was co-authored with the communist historian Phil Foner. And we just, we're going to bracket slavery. Slavery is a completely different story. We're not interested in telling the story of the working day where enslaved people were concerned, and suppose that we could then tell the rest of the story, the white story, without including that story of enslavement. So actually I had to figure a lot of things out with the help of my mentors, George Rowick and Sterling Stuckey, over a very long period of time. And it really took Ronald Reagan to get me to seriously think about who the white worker was and how it would be possible maybe to study the whiteness of the white worker.
So your career so far spans 4 decades-ish. Can you just talk about those 40 years? What does the historian in you tell us that we need to know, or how we need to think about, kind of from Reagan to the present? Like, how do you think about that period of time that you've been immersed in the study of race this entire time, and a changing but stubbornly same America has been kind of unfolding in the background? How do you think about that span of time?
Well, I'm going to talk about it in terms of kind of presidential politics and the ways that people periodize generally. It's not really my biggest interest, but I think that Reaganism and the reaction to Reaganism really shaped that as a coherent body of time. I think that it was not only that Reagan moved the country to the right, followed Carter really in moving the country to the right, but that the Democratic response to try to reel the Reagan Democrats back into the Democratic Party, these working class white people who had been New Dealers but started to vote for Reagan. This is kind of what my book on the history of the middle class is about in its introductory sections, about the ways that in reaction to not being able to win any elections against conservative Republicans, the Democratic Party then itself moved very significantly to the right and to narrowing of debates. I think that what happened in the Clinton years, and really in the groundwork was done for it in these studies that Stanley Greenberg, who's from New Haven, by the way, pollster Stanley Greenberg did these studies of Macomb County, Michigan, which tried to argue that the Democrats could only win by paying attention to this most important progressive space in the United States, which was Macomb County, Michigan. And that was an almost all white space. In his focus groups, it was an all white space. He convened these almost all male focus groups, and the Democrats picked up on all of the white working class, so-called, all of its worst moments got chronicled by Greenberg. And then the idea became that you could only really win elections, so that the progressive stance was to attend to this white working class racism. And I think I wrote about it at the time in New Left Review about the fact that we were beginning to see the labor movement being told that it couldn't have anything because of NAFTA and the kind of global economy. But then we were also seeing that African Americans being told that their demands all had to be defensive demands, because to do otherwise was to alienate the white worker. And so if you didn't have anything in class terms on offer for the white worker, it became very easy to kind of construct this system in which the whole name of the game was to pursue what was sometimes called the middle class, but meant the white middle class vote, to claim to save the middle class rhetorically, are to pay attention to the white working class. After 2016 and the Trump, the postmortems on the Trump victory, it was more often talked about in terms of the white working class than in terms of the middle class. But again, it was talked about by pollsters and commentators as something that didn't really have any kind of substantial politics attached to it, but was the phrase that was often used was, we have to learn to pay attention to the white working class. So I think that is kind of a coherent body of years in which we see this kind of double motion to the right and a double dwindling of the horizons of US electoral politics. There also were incredibly important social movements during that period. So, this didn't keep there from being anti-nuclear movements in Seattle and contestations of globalization and Occupy and Black Lives Matter. The resistance was constant, but it had very, very tough time moving to the political stage to be able to say, and therefore we should do this and this and this. And really the biggest political achievements of Occupy and Black Lives Matter, I think, were to stay out of electoral politics and to keep doing their organizing into, some individuals, of course, did electoral politics as well, but the movement itself has kind of maintained a ground for radical demands that have been outside of a support for this candidate or that candidate.
One of the things that emerges so clearly across your body of work is the way in which both in our political culture, both the phrase working class and the phrase middle class, both are meant to refer to white people.
Right.
For the most part.
Right.
Can you talk about how does that happen? And I guess in your new book, you're really kind of cracking that open a little bit. And how do we think our way out of the traps that are set by that paradigm?
Yeah. You can see it in the January 6th stuff. And the left too is anxious to say these insurrectionists were middle class. And they'll say, well, there were entrepreneurs, failed entrepreneurs, or they're white collar workers. And yet in our more sober moments, we know that those white collar workers are mostly working class people. Now they mostly have lower paying jobs and alienating jobs. So I ended up writing in The Sinking Middle Class about the fact that the United States really didn't use the term middle class very much until the 1930s. And then in the 1930s, magazines like Fortune and some commentators begin to pick up on it and to argue that this kind of proves that even during the rise of the CIO, there was no working class upsurge in the United States. And Fortune produces a poll in 1940 that purports to show, massages figures to show that 80% of the United States identified itself as middle class. But the term middle class in the 19th century almost never appeared in US literature, journalism. And when it did appear, it was in articles about Europe. People were fascinated with Europe as a place that had a middle class. The United States didn't think of itself as being a middle class place at all. Now we could say retrospectively, we know that these people were middle class or were going to become middle class. But the real heyday of the middle class was the Cold War. And when its genius was to kind of join its fortunes to the nuclear family, to the suburban family, to superiority of the American system and American consumption over Soviet style life, so that Nixon and Khrushchev square off in the kitchen debate in a model kitchen from the United States, because the idea is that if you want to claim US superiority, you claim it around the system of social reproduction that the suburbs were actually rapidly abandoning. But at the time, it seemed to differentiate the United States from the Soviet Union, where women worked and where there were cafeterias and not juicers and dishwashers. So in that period, you really get a skyrocketing use of middle class. And because it's joined with anti-communism, where it becomes dangerous to say the words working class, or subversive to say the words working class, it really subsumes that rhetoric. So by the 80s, when Greenberg first goes to Macomb County, it's pretty easy for him to equate the middle class. Sometimes he claims that the Democrats should hire him as their strategist because he knows about the middle class. Other times, he'd been a Marxist historian in South Africa, and before he was denied tenure at Yale. And so at other times, he takes a different view and sort of says, I can tell you about the working class. But he never writes that. It's all, those are only kind of, that language is reserved for memos. So I think there's this kind of both organic and deliberate manufactured separation are kind of playing with the terms middle class and white working class that really set the stage for not just Greenberg, but James Carville and a whole bunch of other important democratic strategists who often, somebody like Carville often packaged that in terms of a strategy about the South. But clearly it was also about more than the South. It was about suburban voters and white collar workers and middle managers. And so we end up with this political rhetoric now where trade unions say that they're middle class organizations. I mean, in the defeat of right to work in Michigan and in the victory over right to work laws in Missouri that just happened, those campaigns were entirely fought around publicity that said defend the middle class, defeat right to work. So I think it's very hard for the term working class to get a hearing.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting though. I mean, that period that you describe where the term middle class emerges as a very common kind of piece of vernacular speech in America. It does coincide with a very particular period in that thing called the middle class, just in terms of the New Deal programs and the post-war kind of prosperity programs and all of the things that we associate with the middle 20th century. I mean, from the standpoint of neoliberalism, Fordism can look pretty good in certain ways, and we shouldn't paint any kind of a golden age, but certainly, you know, the power of unions, the well-paying jobs, like all of the benefits that were won in those years. I don't know if you're familiar with Heather McGhee's argument, but in her recent book, The Sum of Us, she makes the argument that it was really race that caused us to turn our backs on that social contract, that middle 20th century social contract. And her metaphor, even though it's a social reality, but it's also a really powerful metaphor, is the draining of the public pool. That rather than integrate, we will drain the public pool and nobody will swim. And that for her, the kind of post-70s and especially post-Reaganist kind of anti-statist conservative politics that have really dominated the discourse are the drained pool writ large, and that the broken bargain is all about white people's inability to fight for African Americans and other people of color to have the things that they fought for themselves back in the 40s. I wonder how you think about what you were saying about, unions. Let's just take that as an example, and that kind of labor politics. Do we need to look forward or backward in order to kind of to shore up a different kind of political discourse around class and around labor issues?
Let me begin with the draining of the pool, because that interests me an enormous amount in the sense that really critical to me joining the movement in Cairo was that they had a municipal pool, a literal municipal swimming pool. And I would go to it, and it was the one thing. I didn't have much of a social life there. I was only there for 6 weeks a year. And so going to the pool was a very big deal for me in the summer. And when it was finally in the middle of the 60s ordered to be desegregated, Cairo literally drained the pool and filled in the pool. It was integrated for one day. And then it was decided by the town fathers that it was that the hate mattered more than the swimming. And I can vividly remember my mom saying at the time, "Oh, now people will drown again," and she meant white kids, because white kids only had access to the pool. But when she was growing up, that Cairo is where the Mississippi and the Ohio meet. So young people would go get in the river, and then they'd get swept away by currents, and they would drown in one river or the other. And so, I mean, this is a very, very powerful metaphor that is also a reality in that case. I think it's about race. I think that Ruthie Gilmore is also right to say that it's about a certain moment in the global economy and neoliberalism where kind of ruling class willingness to pay for Vietnam and to pay for social programs kind of breaks. And so it's a product, it's not an unmediated product of popular white racism. It's the ability of that racism to be mobilized in favor of cuts in social programs, which of course hurt white people as well. I mean, we all have a terrible COVID experience in order to produce the white advantage that over Black social experience during COVID. So I think that, but I'm not, to take up the, do we look to the future, do we look to the past? The great left watchword is we take our poetry from the future. And I think that's always the case. And in the United States, that Fordist bargain welfare state was so attenuated by race that we can't really look back to it. But it's a really important set of issues. Chris Newfield, who writes about public universities, I used to teach at University of California at Santa Barbara, is developing this analysis of the attack on the public university as an attack on the public university at the very moment that the public university becomes democratized in terms of who can go to it. And I think that, that's what we're seeing in Kansas, that's what we see in California, that's what we see everywhere.
And in fact, that's where Ronald Reagan really cuts his teeth, is his assault on the UC system as governor. And for him, it was the democratization of American education was the thing that was really under his skin, because it meant that all of these anti-war brats were getting free education, and he just railed against that. I mean, it's kind of shocking actually to go back and listen to what he was saying about, at that time, mostly white middle class kids, on a daily basis from the governor's mansion.
Yeah. But now I think it's, I just evaluated a program at Riverside, and Riverside is really an amazing place. It's a place where if you cared about multiracialism in a real way instead of in a rhetorical way, you'd say, well, this is a place where a lot of resources should go to a place like UC Riverside, but it's being taken apart. And then when public universities get taken apart, it's the more recent additions to the university that are the most vulnerable, that don't have the number of majors or the number of student credit hours or the number of faculty to really command a lot of power inside the university. So the cutbacks hurt those parts of the university most that are the most democratized. And nobody says, well, we now accept that African-American studies ought to be a central part of US universities, but what they really mean is a minor part of US universities. And nobody says, what would this have looked like if in 1880 people already began to say, as they said for US history, this ought to be a big part of the US university, then we'd be in a very different kind of situation. But we sort of pay for that past in the vulnerabilities of who's getting cut in the present.
Mm-hmm. I want to urge our listeners. You can use the chat function or the Q&A function to submit questions in real time. But in the meantime, I have 2 more questions. One, I want to loop back to the new book on the middle class. But first, I want to just talk a minute about this moment that we're in. One wishes it were a moment, but I know that you're not always so fond of talking about Donald Trump. When I think about your work on whiteness, I think about the great guitarist Joe Walsh once was introducing Rocky Mountain Way, which had been a hit for him like 40 years earlier. And he said, if I knew I had to sing this song the rest of my life, I never would have written it. And sometimes I'm sure you must feel that way about whiteness, but there is more to say. So how do you think about, in this, as we sit here a month or so out from the insurrection of January 6th, how do you think about the kind of extraordinary displays of white nationalism in recent years, Charlottesville and January 6th most notably, in relation to the more quotidian and kind of entirely ordinary white nationalism that we've been talking about, the kind of white supremacy that characterizes so much of American culture, from naturalization law to urban policing to the subprime and to classic Hollywood cinema? How do you think about the kind of the extraordinary and the ordinary of white supremacy in American political life and social life?
Well, this has been a problem for me for a long time, because I think that, there's a certain fascination with the far right, the white nationalist far right, and that's always carried a danger of saying, well, those are the real racists. And, one of the reasons that so many of, say, my students come to college thinking, well, their family couldn't possibly be implicated in any kind of white supremacist order because they're not like their third cousin who actually is a Klansman. And so the argument for me has always had to be, it's the everyday racism that matters. It's the structural racism that matters. The over-the-top individual racist, not so much. And, I think that's been kind of the best of all of our arguments have been, let's get to racial structures. And now I think that's a little bit more under question. I think we could say both matter a lot. I mean, I've participated a lot in anti-Klan and anti-Nazi movements. I was, the group I was in, the Chicago Surrealist group, was very active in the anti-Nazi campaigns in Skokie, famously in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and in Marquette Park. And so, I always thought that was important to confront Nazis, but I didn't think that they were really in the American grain. And my work is all about the more everyday, the more quotidian racism that you just talked about. And now I'm kind of interested in both. I was very, very interested, and I read something the other day about this, about the Confederate flag making its way to the Capitol. And this person said, well, that's actually not their capital. Richmond is their capital, is their psychic capital. And so think about what a dream this was, to be able to carry that flag. And that's a kind of a level of terror that I think we really haven't seen before, or we haven't seen it as being so close to actual political power, presidential power. I still don't think that it's best to look at those, that mob, our insurrectionists, themselves Nazis. I think that what we're seeing is a kind of a new layer of people who, by and large, aren't necessarily in militia groups. At least that's what the arrests, or who got arrested, seems to tell us, that they were people who were really generated by the Trump movement, not by the white nationalist far right. So, that I think is in some ways worse. White nationalist far right has always managed to isolate itself even from other white racists, but these are people who, command 70 plus million votes and are able to play in everyday politics in a way that they haven't been in the past.
I guess, which brings me back to my last question, which is to go back to your new book, The Sinking Middle Class. Can you just talk a little bit about what you're arguing for there? It's a really iconoclastic shot at the whole notion of the middle class. And I guess my question for you is, looking forward, kind of taking poetry from the future, what's the political answer, or the political prescription that's embedded in the argument you're making about the middle class and the way that it's actually kind of harmed us all?
Well, I think that for me, the biggest surprise in the book was that I began by thinking that the middle class's problem is it's falling, and that, that all of the kind of recent classic books, especially Barbara Ehrenreich's work about the middle class, or what she calls sometimes a professional managerial class, are all about the peril of falling. And it's the Willy Lomans of the world who are the problem of the middle class. What I came to see more and more was that middle class people are miserable and angry, even when they haven't quite fallen, even when they're living a middle class life. It's so predicated on this cycle of kind of super alienated labor, the management of which involves the management of personalities as well as the management of production. So that kind of labor on the one hand, and then compensatory indebted consumption on the other, kind of always chasing after each other to produce some kind of psychological satisfaction. Terry Eagleton, the great Marxist Irish critic, said this is a system that needs a Puritan in the office and an anarchist in the shopping mall. And I think that, really middle class, even child rearing, and here I'm talking kind of upper middle class child rearing and ways of living one's life really do turn on that people, and the system requires both of those things, so that good economic news is a longer work week. On the one hand, the Puritan in the office for more hours, and what's called consumer confidence, but really indebtedness, willingness to undertake debt on the other. So it's, what I came to argue was that, we on the left have often said people are wrong to call themselves middle class. They need to get back to calling themselves working class. And I think in a lot of cases, that would be a very good thing if people recuperated the fact that a lot of their problems come from work. But I also now think that people identify as middle class out of a kind of a congregation of miseries. And so it's not just what people might call false consciousness. It's an actual set of real miseries and alienations and perils that make them experience the middle class as a place of impossibility and of anxiety and failure.
Here's a question that came in before you said what you just said, but I still think there might be pieces of the question that you have more to say about. Today, it seems as though the middle class, especially the downwardly mobile millennial middle class, is one of the main constituencies for the left and significant number of people in this class fraction are engaging in protest movements such as Occupy and supporting the likes of Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos, and the emergent Party of Socialism and Freedom in Brazil. What do you make of this phenomenon, and how might we situate it in the larger history you're telling about the middle class? You've kind of touched on this, but do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I think that these are young people who have seen the miseries of their parents. I mean, I think that in some ways, my curiosity in the sinking middle class was to try to think about my dad's life as somebody who all of his brothers got trades and union working class jobs, and he became a white collar worker and actually had the toughest life of any of them. And I think some of the tragedies in his life kind of positioned me in a way that I think a lot of young people are positioned around thinking about their parents' lives, to say that's not what I can see myself doing. That's not what my next 40 or 50 years are going to be. And then the system also doesn't even provide security to do that. If you wanted to have a secure life of misery, that was on the table in the 1960s and the 1970s. You can't even choose that really in any kind of a clear way now. And so I think that in some ways, materially, the rise of support for these radical movements throughout the world among so-called middle class young people is also a product of the gig economy and of a kind of a possibility of thinking about one of my two children, his whole first 15 years of adulthood were spent trying to avoid having a boss. And you know, I couldn't argue with him. I mean, there were things that he sacrificed because of that. But I think that all of these things conspire, and then police violence, of course, conspires to open these young people to a critique of society, not necessarily in the universities. I think it's mostly happening outside of the universities, but it's happening.
Here's a question about reparations. How do you think about reparations for to compensate African Americans for slavery?
I've long supported reparations. I think it's one of those strange things, like Nancy Fraser and Linda Gordon pointed out, that one of the big achievements of the right was to make welfare a bad word. The word kind of literally means healthy and good things, and yet it was transmuted into being kind of a terrible ideal. And I think reparation, we could say kind of the same thing about it. Who's against repair? Why would people be against kind of reflection and repair? Why would people be against truth and reconciliation? So I've always, well, for 30 years, I've supported reparations. One of the important moments of this for me is when I was in Minneapolis in the early 90s, Keith Ellison, who became a kind of important figure in Congress. At that time, he was calling himself Keith Muhammad, was a Black activist in the Twin Cities. And he really liked my books. And every time I wrote a book, he'd have me on his radio show, and which was a call-in radio show. And he would really set up the book in a very careful way and say, I read it and here's what I got from it, and let's talk about this. And then the calls would be, what do you think of reparations? I mean, the entire Sunday morning crowd, that's what they wanted to hear, what a historian would say. Now, you know, I think it's, the details are important. Our friend Robin Kelly, the UCLA historian, wrote an article a long time ago arguing that it would be a momentous thing if the labor movement got behind reparations for African Americans. And, you know, if it did, the labor movement would also have to make reparations to African Americans if you began to look at the historical record very closely. But Robin's point was that there will always be kind of a wing of the reparation movement that says, I want my check, getting ready for the big payback. I want individual reparations to come to me. But Robin said, what if there were also a concerted effort to make reparations about the rebuilding of communities, so that the cities, that parts of cities that now have the worst healthcare have the best healthcare, that the public libraries, like the one that sponsors this, in Black communities would be the best public libraries, the computer access would be the best. Well, segregation is a terrible reality still, and again, in the United States, but it's not absolute. And so Robin's point was that in many cases, these would be helping poor communities in general, working class communities in general, Puerto Rican communities, as well as African-American communities. So I was very taken with that article, and also taken with the kind of inability of the labor movement to respond to it. And even in the two Sanders campaigns, I think, you know, when it was suggested in the 2016 campaign by Ta-Nehisi Coates that Sanders needed to pay attention to reparations, Coates was roundly condemned by much of the left, by Adolph Reed especially, but by lots of other people as a dilettante and as petty bourgeois, and as some, maybe a stalking horse for Hillary Clinton, even though he was a Sanders supporter. But then you know, you have the same thing, but Coates's point was, you need some kind of concrete issue that's not just a class-based issue that appeals to African Americans. And then you get to 2020 and you still don't have a clear statement of what that issue is. If it's not reparations, what is it, on the part of the Sanders campaign? And Sanders comes to South Carolina and just gets stopped in South Carolina, and you know, and had a good team, including important Black intellectuals on his side in South Carolina, but didn't really have a story to tell beyond the story of a rising social democracy lifts all boats. And so I think it's important politically to have something like a reparations discussion in the mix.
Right. Is it conceivable to you that reparations could be an issue that could be the basis of coalition building? That rather than I think the most common way to think about it is it's impossible because it's a divisive issue, so we have to build a coalition first and then we can take it on. And I guess what I'm asking is there a way that the discussion itself can build new coalitions as part of the infrastructure that would need to exist for there to be such a thing as reparations?
Yeah, I think that there's a fairly substantial part of the white population that some would initially support, but others would hear an argument for reparations around a strategy, something like what Robin was talking about, that this is social rebuilding, it's infrastructural. It absolutely is also about repair of past injustice, and it talks about that injustice. A lot of times I think that the discussion is the most important part. I was at a Mike Brown planning meeting in St. Louis after Brown was murdered, and a lot of people getting ready to do a march, and there was a moment where the chant at that time was "Hands up, don't shoot," and there was then a question about should the white participants in the march also enter that chant? Or, as we had a debate in Lawrence, should the die-in include white participants? Or is it a matter a kind of a false claim to peril that isn't actually borne out necessarily by the facts. What interested me about that St. Louis debate, which went on and on, was you couldn't really predict what people would say. I mean, a lot of the best Black organizers were saying, look, it's a demonstration, it's theater, we want it to be loud, we want everybody to be participating. And a lot of the white allies were saying, oh, you know, I just feel dodgy about this. I don't think I should be doing it. And it wasn't really that a perfect solution was going to be raised. It was that all of that had to be said, and the issue had to be hashed out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's another question about democracy in the workplace. Could you talk about your view of the relationship between workplace democracy and democracy more broadly? How do you see the connection, if any, between the decline, destruction of workplace democracy and the state of American democracy generally?
Well, that's practically all I think about these days, because I mean, I think we see it very strongly in universities, which tended to have some sense of governance processes and democratic talk, if not democratic practice. And now with states of emergency, it's possible to just go straight around those. And so that's the one that I think about less, but the one that I think about more is we're surrounded by packing houses and the ways in which the lack of democracy in the workplace is abetted at every turn by the lack of democracy in the state. So you have these immigrant workers, sometimes from 30 or 40 places in the same factory. They're being put to work next to each other. They know that COVID is a threat. The state tells them they can't get workmen's compensation without incredible ordeals. The president, when Trump was the president, says, you know, you're essential workers. You have to go to work. So all of this lack of workplace democracy, production of workplace death, is a product of the workplace, and it's a product of the state. And Peter Ratcliffe was telling me the other day that 60% of packing houses are still unionized in the United States. So it's also, I think the figures on that vary, but it's still one of the most union dense industries in the United States. And it hasn't been wildly different necessarily in the plants that are unionized versus the plants that aren't unionized. So I think that question of how we produce some kind of workers' power at the point of production to at least be able to say, no, I don't want to do something that's deadly. The auto workers managed for a while to kind of pull that off early in COVID, but in general, we've seen where the lack of workplace democracy leads. And I think, you know, it used to be 25 years ago when I was talking to labor audiences, people would often say, we've got to elect the Democrats and then we can build a labor movement. And now I think it's almost turned even worse to say, it would be nice to have a labor movement, then they'd vote, then maybe workers would vote more for Democrats. And so the actual independent push toward workers' power is very, very weak at the moment. And you know, it could turn very fast. The Amazon vote is a very, very critical organizing moment, and it's a very fragile system. The polling support for unions is strong, but we've for 15 years now said, oh, it's starting over. It's Republic windows and doors. It's the Wisconsin uprising. It's whatever it is. We've always thought that the labor movement was about to be able to produce some organizing momentum again. And so far, it really hasn't. So I think this is another important moment.
We only have a couple more minutes. Maybe we'll end by You mentioned Chris Newfield's work on the university, and it is true that the university has been under assault for more than a generation now, and that's important. On the other hand, it's also true that universities are incredibly powerful institutions on their local scenes, maybe none more than Yale in New Haven, and they aren't always good actors, as we know. Can you talk a little bit about how do you think about the good work that universities do and can do, and you know, how do we make universities into better citizens in their cities, as DeBerry and Baldwin calls the university, often a city that's dominated by a supposedly liberal institution, but acts so illiberal in so many ways. How do you think about the university as a kind of actor on the stage?
This won't be that global, but in Lawrence, we have at University of Kansas, we have a big organizing drive going among the faculty now. Our graduate students are unionized, and the response of the administration has been to threaten to cut, well, to order departments to cut 40% of all GTA, graduate teaching assistant positions. So I think the first thing that, and I realize that Yale and Harvard are different universe that I probably am not so qualified to talk about. But in the public universities, I think one of the things that has to happen is to stop doing terrible things. And then the second thing that has to happen is to maybe tone down the rhetoric about multiculturalism if it's completely unmoored from any kind of structural change in the university, so that, you know, we'll get, without any consultation with either the city or the people of color organizations on campus, our university started a George Floyd scholarship without any kind of way of democratizing that discussion, and then kind of says, well, we need to come back into the classroom, even though there's still COVID, because look, we're the voice of social justice in this place. So, you know, I think that the first step really is, as CLR James used to say, to reach for the astringent spray a little bit and to say, let's stop with some of the more extravagant dream work that we sometimes participate in about, and again, I'm talking about state universities in the Midwest, which is what I know about, but the multiculturalism becomes a kind of a way to justify high tuition, on tenure, all of the other things that it imparts a kind of sanctimonious veneer to those kinds of actual policy decisions.
Yeah. Words to live by: stop doing terrible things.
The start.
As a start, just as a start. Is that too much to ask? Dave Roediger, always a pleasure. In a better world, we would be together at the Public Library in New Haven, but maybe that day is coming. But thank you so much for all you do, the work and the leadership, and thanks for taking the time to chat with us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah. Two program notes. One, next week, Phil Goff, the need for a third US Reconstruction. And since we mentioned Chris Newfield, I will mention now that he's actually going to be here as part of this series later in the spring. So watch the date for that. He's doing amazing work on the future and the meaning of higher education in a so-called democracy. Thank you all. Wash your hands, take good care, wear a mask, and be careful out there. And we will see you soon. Thank you, Dave.